We're going to start digging and get a better understanding of what's going on and what is getting reported. Traditionally, the CDC reports ILIs as part of their surveillance report. ILIs are influenza-like illnesses. We can go look at their glossary and see that it says a clinical definition, not a laboratory one. That is, no test is needed to diagnose and report an ILI from a surveillance standpoint. In previous years, coronavirus have largely been lumped into this ILI category because we did not have a test. From a mortality standpoint, the CDC lumps together pneumonia and influenza in their P&I statistics. These are the mortality curves that I've been showing in Euromomo, among other sources. Without testing, we do not know the cause of death. Historically, this would be an ILI or a P&I, the flu, or simply old age. That is, without tests, we do not know the viral or bacterial profile or the cause of death. We can look back historically and see the seasonal flu variation has a marked stochastic component to it. We can see that in the 2017-18 flu season, it looks pretty bad, but not a peep was made out of it. That year, there were an estimated 45 million infections, 810 hospitalizations, 61,000 P&I deaths with an estimated 650,000 P&I deaths worldwide. We can look at the viral profile of that year and see the distribution of bugs in the positive test reports, and we can see that varies over time in the flu season. Looking at this year, we see a similar pattern with the distribution of bugs over the season. That is, different seasons have different distributions of bugs, and even that varies over time. What we don't see is coronavirus, as it is not technically an influenza virus. From our earlier post, we saw that there was a distribution of bugs that varied from year to year, and that distribution varied even within a single season. The CDC has historical data going back over 20 years tracking influenza viruses, so that's where we'll start. But first, we need to look at the taxonomy of the distribution. The two broadest groups that are tracked are influenza A and influenza B. I don't pretend to understand the distinctions between the subtypes, lineages, clades, and subclades, but it's clear that even among these two types of A and B, there is a distribution within the distribution and further distributions under that. Looking back at the 1997 to 1998 season, we note that nearly all of the positive test results were influenza A, with about 3/4 of the 13,000 positive tests of influenza A not being subtyped in yellow, and about 1/4 being subtyped as H3 in red, a handful of unspecified influenza B in green, and 6 of the 13,000 positive tests being influenza A H1 in blue. It's too small to see. It is important to note in the 1997-1998 season, there were no positive results for H1N1 or swine flu, nor were there any positive test results for influenza B, Victoria lineage, or Yamagata lineage. Fast forward a decade later to the 2007-2008 flu season, the one just before swine flu, and we see a massive increase in testing and positive test results with over 40,000 positive test results, triple that of just a decade earlier. We also note that the proportions of positive test results has changed, with influenza B, still no lineages, moving from less than 1% a decade earlier to about 1/4 of the positive tests now. What does that mean? Alongside these cumulative positive test results, we see the temporal pattern of test-seeking behavior that, as expected, matches the flu season. Embedded in that graphic as well, we can see the changing distribution of bugs in the test-positive stream, with H1 in blue seeming to start a little earlier in the flu season, and influenza B in green picking up a head of steam somewhere around the middle and finishing out the tail of the distribution. So in the 10 years between 1997 and 2007, if we looked at the huge jump in positive test results, we might easily conclude that there was a massive increase in flu. Or did we see a massive increase in testing into the nearly endless reservoir of test-positive patients? It is important to note that there are still only 4 bugs identified on a list of 8 or 9, depending on how you want to look at it. As well, the dominant category of bugs is still influenza A in yellow with no subtyping performed. There is no H1N1 or swine flu, and there are no bugs here in teal that they were unable to subtype. This is the year before the swine flu pandemic. Let's look at 2008, 2009, the year of the swine flu, where things are really going to get interesting. Let's take a look at 2008, 2009. We're going to switch from a cumulative view to a running 3-week view so we can observe the stream of testing as we progress through the flu season. Here we are, 11 years ago to the day as noted, with these gray bars at the end of the flu season, and there is no swine flu. That is, we are at the end of the week, April 18, 2009, and there's not a single case of swine flu. As we saw from the earlier year, influenza B is the predominant strain and the test positive strain. There was nothing going on but a normal flu season, just like this year, until we had a test. So, where is H1N1? It's swine flu season. At this point, week ending April 18th, 2009, it's pretty much the end of flu season. We can see that right here. Well, H1N1 is lost in the distribution of type A, not subtyped, here in yellow until we have a test for it. We can see here the huge orange bars spanning spring and summer months, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. It's the end of April, and flu season is over. Or is it? Enter the flu chip. Or any one of another jillion tests. It doesn't matter. Or maybe it does. The flu chip is a low-density DNA microarray for the identification of influenza viruses. The project was funded in 2003 by the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. Let's check that out. The NIAID is one of 27 institutes and centers that make up the NIH. I wonder who runs that. When did the H1N1 epidemic start again? Well, it was after flu season. End of April, beginning of May. When did they license that flu chip? Press release, April 28th, 2009. When I began doing this homework, I thought, well, it's just testing and artifacts, and clinicians do not understand tests and testing. I'm not so sure of that anymore. Let's look at the H1N1 pandemic through the lens of tests and testing. We see the end of a normal, perhaps even quiet flu season, and the introduction of a new test at the end of the flu season that purportedly discovers a new bug from an earlier post. Fauci and the rest of the crowd are on TV stirring up hysteria about this new bug that we fortunately have just developed a test for. We see this go from 0 cases at week 18 to 14 cases the following week to thousands of cases for weeks on end, and people are spinning out of control as there's a constant onslaught of news on TV and the internet about the swine flu and comparisons to 1918. This drives mass hysteria, which drives even more testing. Keep in mind, this is spring and summer. It's not even flu season. Anyone can go back and look at the headlines from those times, as the internet is forever. The U.S. prepares for possible swine flu epidemic as global cases rise. Flu has the U.S. surgical mask producers scrambling. A new pandemic, fear, shortage of surgical masks. We've heard these things before. This is from May of 2009. The same kind of hysteria went on with SARS in 2003. While we look at this bra mask from the 2003 SARS panicdemic, it's not any different from the tablecloth bandana and other ridiculous things being suggested today. Over the pond, the same thing is happening in the UK. We see the normal statistical variation of flu seasons in blue and the matching cyclical pattern of flu season deaths in yellow going back 15 years. This is 2004. And then there's this weird spike right here, the tallest spike being over 3 times all of the previous years. What is that? It is the freakout spike of patients going in to get tested for the H1N1 virus in spring and summer. The testing created and drove the hysteria and drove the test-seeking behavior, as there was absolutely no corresponding mortality. In fact, if we look at mortality, it's at one of the lowest times in the past 15 years. What actually happened? Nothing. Nobody died. There were about 600 deaths attributed to H1N1 for the 5-month observation period from April to August, over which about 15,000 people died in car wrecks, another 15,000 from suicide, 5,000 from opioids. This is from a decade ago. Worldometer estimates there were 350,000 worldwide suicides so far this year. The list goes on and on. The CDC discontinued reporting of individual confirmed and probable cases of H1N1, and it is now part of the seasonal distribution of ILI bugs and continues to circulate seasonally. This is not updated from 2009. The other thing that happened is the CDC released a 2009 H1N1 pandemic timeline. We see in that timeline the recommendations to close schools, and a host of other recommendations came out, which were largely ignored. So importantly, while they certainly tried, we did not have the hysterical government reaction and draconian measures that have essentially cured the disease by killing the patient. What really happened? If we weren't looking at a rise in cases, what were we looking at? What happened is directly pictured in this graph. We saw a rise in cases that was directly related to the rise in testing, which was directly related to the availability in testing. H1N1 did not go from 0 to 14 to 1,000 to thousands of people across the country in a matter of weeks, but the shipments of test kits certainly can. The evidence for that is directly in the testing. Influenza B in green, H3 in red, H1 in dark blue, unable to subtype in teal. Not a peep was made about those. All of these went up simply because we increased testing. So everyone seems to be looking at these curves and seeing this rise in positive cases that was particularly frightening early on. And there's a reason we spent time with H1N1 is to learn to understand this. These curves, like we see at this Johns Hopkins website for coronavirus, these curves are a function of at least two things. On one end, the actual increase in cases in the presence of infinite testing capacity and infinite testing rate. The second thing, as we saw with H1N1, is they're a function of the availability of the tests. Let's take a closer look at this cumulative graph that looks particularly frightening and seems to be driving decision-making. It seems to be the only driver for decision-making. So there are essentially no cases in January, like week 14 of the H1N1 pandemic, as there really isn't a deployable test at this time. Positive cases start to pick up in February. Let's take a look at the daily caseload. We're dinking along with only a handful of cases because, well, we only have a handful of tests. Europe's a few weeks ahead of us, not in the disease, which is already well entrenched in the population, just like it was with H1N1, but ahead in the testing because it got shipments of tests from WHO. Then we get this bump right here in February. What's that? The CDC ships out a bunch of tests to domestic and international laboratories on February 6th. The labs get the tests, then the positive test results then show up as a jump in positive cases, and that could easily be misinterpreted as the disease is spreading, when in fact it's just the test that's spreading. Then the available pool of tests dries out, and the finger pointing begins about not having enough tests. So the spike of positive test results that were a direct result of the bolus of test kits that the CDC sent, that testing spike returns to baseline, and companies rush to produce test kits which are supposed to have regulatory approval. No problem, we'll relax the regulations and make on tests and make millions. Medicine spools up for testing, And within weeks, those tests start to ship, and we begin testing into the essentially infinite pool of test-positive patients, just like H1N1. As we test more and more rapidly, it looks like the flu is spreading like wildfire through March, when all that is happening is we're getting faster at testing. If we step back in time with this screenshot from the end of March, when people really started to freak out and governments were starting to really clamp down with stay-at-home orders and fines and paying snitches for ratting out their neighbors, we see this curve really starting to steepen here. And people talking about the spread of the disease and the doubling times, when all they're really looking at is the availability and rate of the testing into a population in the world. When all they're really looking at is the availability and rate of testing into a population of hundreds of millions in the world that already had the disease. The only constraint on the steepness of this curve was the availability of the testing. The cumulative scale hints at a fairly linear increase in cases starting in early April, which hints at no changes in what was incorrectly interpreted as the rate of spread of disease. The daily and logarithmic scales are more revealing as we get a better sense of the rates that things are happening. Here in the log scale, we see the CDC shipment as this rate spike here, the rate flattening due to the lag in testing while the finger pointing is going on and the manufacturing of tests is spooling up, and then the increase in rate as we spool up and deploy tests and begin testing. This does not demonstrate the rate of spread of the disease, but demonstrates the testing speed, and now a reflattening of the curve as we reach maximum capacity and speed. Daily cases paints the same picture with a dramatic increase in testing capacity in March, with millions of tests shipped, increasing rates of testing into the endless stream of positive patients, making it look like the disease is spreading. Then a leveling off, starting perhaps in early April, with most of April showing simple statistical variation on a stable but maxed out testing rate. That said, for sure, the disease was spreading, people were getting sick, some were hospitalized, and there were some fatalities, but all within the statistical variation of a normal flu season until we intervened. The other thing we can perhaps get an order of magnitude estimate on from this curve is the disease prevalence. To get a prevalence estimate, we need to construct a numerator and a denominator. For the denominator, we can go back to when the CDC shipped out these kits. They sent about 200 of them out to national and international labs. Each kit could do maybe 700 or 800 people for a low total of perhaps 140,000. For the numerator of positive cases for a prevalence estimate, we can see the daily cases that we pretty much blew through with those 140,000 kits in less than a week from February 13 to February 20, as the test capacity was declining in early February to about 500-600 a day, tests as a baseline, and then returned to that baseline the week after Feb 21. So let's add it up. So we've got 15,000 positives on Feb 13, 6,500 on Valentine's Day, which probably didn't make for such a great date night, and a couple thousand a day for the remaining 4 days until it looks like it returns back down to baseline. That's a total of 8,000. So over that 6-day period where the CDC tests were being blown through, we had about 30,000 positives. We'll want to subtract the baseline tests off of that positive numerator of 30,000. So say 6 days at 600 tests a day for 3,600. We'll round that up to 4,000. So about 30,000 positive tests over that 6 days. And we can attribute, say, 4,000 of them to the baseline testing, leaving about 26,000 or so positives attributable to the 140,000 CDC tests. 26,000 over 140,000, we get a prevalence of, say, around 20%. Well within the historical norms of coronavirus prevalences ranging from 5 to even 25 or 30%. I don't pretend to understand the virology or underlying biology of influenza-like illnesses, but I've got a pretty good handle on tests and testing, and I hope I've made the case that tests and testing alone, the poor understanding of the issues surrounding tests and testing that are well known, is what is driving this problem. Do we really want to go through this next year when a new virus is discovered? The lockdown measures, the depression, alcoholism, drug abuse, with their ensuing mortality? To me, even if these draconian interventions worked, it would seem clear that we're trading the lives of old, sick people for the lives of the young and healthy, and perhaps worse, the morbidity of the surviving. Please help spread this message, and maybe someone in government will have the courage to stand up and say, enough.